to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants and cabin crew, please.
We're taught today by the Darwinians, or those who espouse the Darwinian theory, that life evolved from an initial pool of water with molecules in it that were basically inorganic, and that some way, sometime, somehow, those inorganic molecules were swept together into a living entity, something that was somehow alive. Now, we know that's not true now, and it's beginning to shift. The teaching is still the same because it takes a while to change the books, but it's becoming acknowledged that life almost had to be delivered to Earth. And the facts are incontrovertible that that's going to be the truth. When life first appears at around 4 billion years ago, the solar system itself is only about 500 million years old, only about 500 million years old. Not really enough time for anything to develop because the Earth was still basically a seething ball of magma then. Very little land had actually cooled out, very little water would be available for anything to form in. The Darwin's warm pool, warm pond, couldn't possibly have existed when life first came. Not only did life come suddenly at a time when it's just inexplicable that that would happen, it came in not one form but in two forms. Prokaryotic bacteria, there are two kinds. For a long time it was thought that there was just one kind, but there are actually two. So you have suddenly, at around 4 billion years ago, two distinct separate kinds of prokaryotic bacteria appear on Earth as the first life forms. And those life forms were so complex and so complicated, even though they didn't have the nucleus of the eukaryotic bacteria, which came later, much later. Even though they didn't have cell nucleus, they are functioning to this day, because we have them to this day. Their functioning is so complex, so chemically complex, there's no doubt that it couldn't possibly have developed here. It had to have been delivered here, and it had to be delivered whole and intact, and it had to come at about 4 billion years ago. So, given those facts right out of the box, there is no Darwinian development at the first stage of life as we understand it. Then as you move along through the history, Darwin postulated that from that beginning, however that beginning occurred, and he was no more clear on it than we were until just recently, however that beginning occurred, it had to develop very slowly but very regularly toward more and more complex beings, more creatures, however you care to term that. And as that slow, gradual progression developed, ever more sophistication was put into the system by what he called natural selection, which is little traits that would somehow help a creature improve its odds of reproducing itself, would make for more and more and more sophisticated beings and creatures. And that's how we supposedly evolved, a word Darwin didn't use but which became popular later. We evolved from those bacteria through millions and millions and millions of slight improvements to creatures that were the intermediate forms. Now, when Darwin put forth his theory in 1869, he said very clearly, if the intermediate forms that I'm postulating cannot be found, then my theory is wrong. He knew that there was a problem because even in his day it was clear in the fossil record that there were these huge gaps and then things would just suddenly appear. So he said, now that we know to look for them, we should find these intermediate species. We haven't found any really to this point. We do find development within species, we do find changes at the at the micro level, which is changes in parts. Darwin himself found the changes in the beaks of the finches, Darwin's finches. The shells of the tortoises that he found on the Galapagos. So he found indications of change at the micro level, at the part level. And what he postulated, what he extrapolated is, well, if we can see obvious change at the micro level, then we can legitimately assume that change also is going to occur at the macro level, at the whole body level, so that it will be possible for one species to change into, over time, another species entirely. And that was the bedrock of his theory. And again, he said, but if you can't find any transitional species where it's clear that one thing is turning into something else, or that thing is turning into something else yet again, there will be a problem. And that's been the result of much more detailed analysis of the fossil record. There are no intermediate species. Now, once scientists began to understand that and realize that what you saw was long periods of life existing in what is called stasis, which means the same. It basically stays the same. In the fossil record, you have these long periods of stasis followed by these periods of catastrophe where everything is just gone. It's wiped out. Not everything, but most everything. And then you have these periods of not much happening, and then suddenly the niches get filled up again very rapidly, these explosions of life forms. So when science in the 50s and 60s began to see what the reality of the situation was and how far it was from classic Darwinism, which they were already very heavily bought into because that's what they used to maintain the moral high ground against the creationists, they knew they had a problem. So Stephen Gould and some others came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And what punctuated equilibrium says is that as life develops, there are catastrophes that wipe them out. It's pretty clear from the fossil record that these happen. There's been 5 major ones and several minor ones. In the major ones, you had wipeouts of life forms anywhere from 50% to 80%, 90% of all life forms wiped out. The first big one, the Permian, wiped out about 90% of the life forms that existed at that time. And yet, after this happens, the ecological niches are filled with new species that are suited to the new environment, whatever it is. So you have the catastrophe that changes everything, changes the atmosphere, and changes the earth. Some things survive because they are adapted or are able to adapt themselves to the new environment. But then new species come in that are adapted to whatever that new environment is each time. Now, how does that happen? How can that happen? How can they rapidly fill in within a few thousand years all of the niches? Can evolution do that? No. There's no record. You would have to see it. The example that I give when I talk is this, that you take a kernel of popcorn. Now, under normal circumstances, under the Darwinian scheme of things, if you were to heat that popcorn kernel, it would puff itself into one piece of popcorn. And that's the Darwinian theory of one thing moving into the next stage up its ladder as it goes. But during punctuated equilibrium, what they're postulating is that the one kernel of popcorn is somehow going to pop itself into a whole big bucket that you get at the movie. That really is not possible, and yet that's what they're saying. They're saying that the few survivors somehow explode biologically and genetically into all these different species that fill the ecological niches. That really, it can't happen under the Darwinian scenario. So what you have the punctuated equilibrium people saying is that Darwinism works when it can work, but when it can't work, something else works, which is so how do you turn a force of nature on and off like a switch? Can't really happen. What I think and what I say is probably Earth is being terraformed. Earth is being watched over. And when they see that a catastrophe has happened, they wait, they give it time to settle out, they give the new environment time to establish itself. They come in, they take some tests, and they say, okay, these things can live here now, and these things are dumped off here to live and make their way until the next catastrophe. That explains the facts to me, for as silly as it sounds. You know, terraformers, cosmic dump trucks is another term that I use. For as silly as that sounds, it seems to match the facts of what the fossil record tells us better than Darwinism by a long shot. But obviously, because it's so far from Darwinism, the establishment is so heavily bought into Darwinism, it isn't going to be readily accepted. But I think over time, something like that is going to be the real true answer of what's going on.
So, as far as humans are concerned, like, you know, the micro and macro evolution, we're told that we evolved from primates.
Right.
So, how does that play in? I mean, what does that bear out? I mean, how
No, we are told, as far as human beings go, we are told that we evolved in the Darwinian sense from primates. That we are related genetically and biologically and very closely to chimpanzees and somewhat more distantly to gorillas and orangutans and gibbons. So, but chimpanzees are our closest genetic and biological relatives. So we are primates. We are all considered primates, all of us in the primate family, the chimps and the gorillas and us. The problem is we really don't share any of the basic fundamental primate traits. Starting with our bones. Our bones are much lighter and less dense than are all the other primate bones. Our muscles are much weaker than any other primate's muscles, 5 to 10 times as weak. So where our bones are less dense, our muscles are substantially weaker. Right there you have a problem. Our skin is completely different. We have a layer of subcutaneous fat under our skin that no primate has. We've got it. Doesn't make sense. We have a hair pattern on our bodies that is substantially different. Not only is the hair reduced, but in all other primates, the thickness is on the back and it's thinner on the front. We have thickness on the front, thinness on the back. What adaptive advantage would that have? As far as our hair itself and our nails, both toenails and fingernails, our hair grows, our nails grow. They have to be physically trimmed. In all primates, their hair grows to a certain length, their nails grow to a certain length, and they stop. They don't have to bite their nails. So, again, you have a radical difference there. In our heads, you have a completely different look about the faces. The prognathous face of all primates except us, the lack of a voice box, I mean the lack of the ability to modulate speech and do speech the way we do. Not that they can't make sounds. They make very loud sounds, but they can't break those sounds into small little pieces the way we can to make language. So there's that difference, and just the difference in our faces in general. There's huge difference in our brains. Huge difference in our brains. So you've got all of that, and then on top of the clincher to the argument is this. All primates have 48 chromosomes, and we have 46. Now, how do you lose 2 whole chromosomes from where you are and produce a being that is so much more skilled and adapted, particularly intellectually, as we are? You would think if we're going to be such a vast improvement over the primates, we would have, 56 or 58 or maybe 60 chromosomes. How do you lose 2 chromosomes and get better. It really makes no sense. None of it. When you really just sit down and look at the very basics of it, none of it makes sense. We're not primates. We are not primates. To call us primates is to insult us and them, because there's just no connection. The only thing that's similar is that we share 99% the same DNA with chimps. And that sounds impressive. Wow, we're almost them. How could 1% make so much difference? Well, over a 3 billion base pair genome, you're looking at, what, 30 million different base pairs. That's a lot of room. If you know what you're doing, that's a lot of room to make changes, if that's what you're going to do. So there is room there, but it also overlooks the fact that humans share 50% of the genes with mice. So to say that we share 99% with chimps is impressive. To say that we share 50% with mice is even more impressive. It's all the same. All living things share a huge portion of their DNA, because why? We're all made of the same 4 base pairs and the same 20 amino acids. Anything that lives is sharing those things. So that's the common root formula for life, not just here, but everywhere. Wherever life is, that's got to be the bottom line for all of it. So that there's going to be similarities, I think, wherever you find life.